I became seriously ill roughly 20 years ago and spent 8 years misdiagnosed with an autoimmune disorder, an autoimmune brain disease. Was treated for that very aggressively with very threatening treatments, while the primary symptoms that I had were never explained. So I was continually told, you have this very dangerous disease, here's your very dangerous meds, and yet your primary symptoms, those are psychiatric. So we did that for 8 years, and then we discovered that diagnosis was wrong. I spent a further 4 years with no diagnosis, being told, yes, well, you have 15 abnormal brain scans, but there's actually nothing wrong with you. It's a psych problem. And eventually, I gave up on the medical community, and with a research background, I taught myself to read medical papers related to my symptoms and discovered for myself the name of the rare disease that I have. Then I found doctors who were familiar with it, mostly in Europe, and they did some tests, and it turned out that I was right, that I had this very rare disease called Sneddon syndrome. And I got treatment for that, and I got my life back. So for me, the problem of mistaken psych diagnosis for medical symptoms is very palpable, very real. I now run the Foundation for Sneddon syndrome, so on a daily basis, I see patients who suffer immeasurably year after year and who die because of mistaken psych diagnoses. So that particular problem is very vivid to me. The term rare disease is confusing because people assume that it's rare for a person to have a rare disease, but that is very definitely not the case. Rare disease is not rare by any stretch. There are 30 million people in the United States with rare diseases, another 30 million in Europe, and that amounts to 1 in 10 Americans. So one person on every crowded elevator, 50 people on every jet. This means that 1 in 10 Americans head to their doctors with disorders that will almost certainly lead to diagnostic confusion and uncertainty. So it means that the medical community needs a very careful way of handling symptoms that they don't understand. If it were the case that patients with rare diseases were uncommon, it would make sense to have no sort of system for dealing with confusing symptoms. But I think that the medical community, they have a phrase when they're teaching diagnostic processes to medical students where when you hear hoofbeats, think horses, not zebras. That's a standard sort of adage in medical school and residency. But the reality is that zebras are very, very common. 1 out of 10 times when you hear the hoofbeats, it's a zebra. I think that there's a great deal of discussion about, theoretical reasons why it's a problem and, the problem of unnecessary psych care and, of course, the problem of a stigma in your medical record that you think you have medical symptoms when they're actually psych. Those are all very real problems. But the serious concern here is medical. There's a very, very direct threat to the health of a great many people when they broaden the criteria for psych diagnosis for apparently medical symptoms. I think that with any explanation for medical symptoms, you expect physicians to approach the diagnostic process with some humility about the possibility of error. And, of course, you expect the same thing with the diagnosis of somatic symptom disorder or the old somatoform disorders. You expect that they go through a process of putting together a set of what they call differential diagnoses, a set of possible explanations for the symptoms, and then they rule out the ones that don't make sense, and what remains is the one that works. That's a standard process. But the new category of somatic symptom disorders actually removes the stipulation that doctors should view the psych explanation as one of many possibilities, where all the other possibilities are medical. They actually took that out and replaced it with nothing. And I think there are reasons to expect that doctors would have more concern about the problem of error in somatic diagnoses than with other medical explanations for medical symptoms. In the first place, it's a scenario where doctors, people trained in one field are making determinations in another field. These are physicians who are making determinations about psychiatric diagnoses. So just there on the face of it, you see the potential for error. These people are not trained in psych for the most part, so you would expect doctors would be especially concerned about their ability to make psychiatric diagnoses or diagnoses outside of their field. In addition to that, I think there's a second reason you would expect them to be concerned with the problem of error, and that is that when a patient receives a psych diagnosis for apparently medical symptoms, the result is a denial of further medical care for those symptoms. That is a very, very big step. If a patient presents with symptoms that are apparently medical, the patient is suffering or there's some harm, and the doctor decides, no, there's no harm, these are psychiatric symptoms. If that doctor is wrong, if the physician makes that diagnosis in error, they leave a patient suffering and dealing with threat of harm potentially for a lifetime. So these two reasons, the fact that you end up with a denial of medical care and the fact that doctors are not trained in psych would lead you to expect that they would be especially concerned about the problem of error in somatic diagnoses in general. But the DSM-5 widens the net, takes out the specific criteria for these kinds of diagnoses for medical symptoms. And I would say it greatly magnifies the possibility of error in somatic explanations for medical symptoms. I mean, I believe that it magnifies the problem of error to an extent that should be quite frightening to ordinary people. I mean, we don't get to know if we're the one in 10 who have a rare disorder. If we know that our doctors are likely to say, I don't understand it, therefore it's psych, this is a very threatening situation. The DSM-5 has raised the level of that threat to a point where I think ordinary people should be very concerned. The problem is that currently, even before the DSM-5 comes out, in the current scenario with the somatoform disorders in the DSM-4, there is absolutely no system of checks and balances. There are no protocols to minimize the possibility of error in psych diagnoses for apparently medical symptoms. There is absolutely zero attention paid to the problem. And in fact, the phrase medically unexplained symptoms in the medical world is actually equivalent to the phrase medically unexplainable symptoms. They mean the same thing. So doctors don't even have the terminology to discuss situations where patients have symptoms they don't understand, and yet those symptoms are medical. Because, doctors are human beings, and for some reason our culture tends to forget that. When they're confronted with a patient whose symptoms are hard to explain, that's uncomfortable. Nobody likes to be in a situation where they're not succeeding in their field. So there are incentives, personal incentives for doctors to very quickly say, I don't understand it, therefore it's psych. And that's not a crime, and that's not surprising. Doctors are people, so it makes sense that they would very quickly jump to the psych explanations for symptoms that they don't understand. But what's needed there is some kind of middleman, some kind of accountability, some stage that is put in place to protect patients from mistaken psych diagnoses for medical symptoms. I mean, if it were up to me, it would involve, in every case, a psychiatric evaluation that must come up with independent findings for a psych problem. I think that there needs to be some kind of stage in the diagnostic process before you get to, this is psych, so you don't get any medical care. Bye. There needs to be something in between that ensures that the doctor's decision-making process on that is well supported. And, given that there are 30 million Americans, 1 in 10 people with diseases that are going to confuse most doctors, that most doctors have never seen or even heard of, it's just statistically necessary to have a stage in there that protects those 30 million people from mistaken denial of care. Once a patient's symptoms get to the point where the doctor says, yeah, I've done standard tests and I still don't understand it, I think it might be psychiatric, I think at that point psych should become involved to ensure that denial of medical care does not occur in a rash way. And at that point, the evaluations are valuable. But again, I mean, the current system is, here's my patient, I can't explain the symptoms, I think it's psych. And then very often the psych community will respond by saying, well, we don't find any specific psych problems, but the doctor says there are no explanations for your symptoms, therefore we think you have a somatic disorder or a conversion disorder or functional neurological disorder, one of those things. In the psych community, the current scenario is if the doctor says there are no explanations for the patient's symptoms, the patient has a psych problem, even in the absence of any independent findings. And given the statistics on rare disease and the numbers of autoimmune disease patients who are dismissed as psych patients, that's just not a defensible approach. That cannot be medically sound. So the psych community, too, needs to adjust the way that they assess patients whose symptoms are difficult to understand, and end the assumption that unexplained symptoms are in fact unexplainable symptoms, so that patients who are finally determined to have somatic disorders are determined to have them on the basis of independent findings of some psychiatric pathology.